Nuremberg 1947, courtroom 600. The air was thick with the smell of old tobacco, cold sweat, and the dust of thick files. Pale artificial light shone down on the dock, where men who once held the power of life and death over an entire continent were seated. Among them, some looked like real executioners, grim faces, wild eyes, coarse manners, but not Otto Ohlendorf. If you walked into the courtroom unaware of the context, you'd mistake this man for a defense lawyer, an expert witness, or a university professor lecturing on economic theory. He sat upright, his well-tailored suit hugging his small but neat frame. His face had an intellectual, composed look, with a high forehead and bright, intelligent eyes. He spoke softly, clearly, using the precise terminology of academia. But it was this very ordinariness that was the most terrifying thing. When prosecutor Benjamin Ferencz, a small man carrying a blazing fire of justice, asked about the number of victims Ohlendorf's unit, Einsatzgruppe D, had murdered in southern Ukraine in less than a year, the entire courtroom held its breath. They expected a denial. They expected blame shifted to superiors. They expected fake tears or stubborn silence. Ohlendorf did none of those things. He adjusted his posture, looked the prosecutor straight in the eye, and replied with the tone of a chief accountant reporting an error in the year-end balance sheet. 90,000, he said. Not I think it was, not approximately, but the precise round number of 90,000. He confirmed it not with the boastfulness of a bloodthirsty killer, but with the pride of a civil servant who had excellently fulfilled a quota. In the mind of Otto Ohlendorf, the deaths of 90,000 people, men, women, elderly, children, was not a human tragedy. It was a data point, a statistic that needed to be managed, reported, and filed. To understand Otto Ohlendorf, we must perform a painful psychological autopsy. We are not facing a schizophrenic who hears voices ordering murder. We are facing a monster created by extreme rationality. He represents the banality of evil at its most sophisticated level. Let's turn back time to see how this tumor was formed. Ohlendorf was born in 1907, the son of a devout farming family. He was intelligent and eager to learn. He studied law and economics at the prestigious universities of Leipzig and Göttingen. He was a genuine intellectual, a doctor of law. Before the war, he worked at the Kiel Institute for World Economics. He studied National Socialism not as a street thug smashing Jewish shop windows with a club, but as a theorist seeking the perfect social structure for Germany. The dissociation began here. For Ohlendorf, ideology was not emotion, but science. If science proved that a certain race was dangerous to the nation's existence, then eliminating that race was not a crime, but a necessary social hygiene procedure. He saw human beings as cells in a large body. If that cell was deemed cancerous, the doctor had to cut it out. No one calls the surgeon a murderer for removing a tumor. Ohlendorf considered himself that doctor. In 1941, Operation Barbarossa erupted. Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union. Ohlendorf, by now an SS Gruppenführer, Major General, was assigned to command Einsatzgruppe D. His mission: follow the regular army Wehrmacht and cleanse the rear area. Cleansing here was a euphemism for executing Jews, Gypsies, Romani, and communist officials. This is where the gruesome contrast becomes apparent. Ohlendorf was not a typical military commander. He disliked chaotic violence. He was disgusted by scenes of drunk soldiers beating victims in the streets. He considered such actions undisciplined and staining the honor of the SS men. A mass murderer worried about honor, that's the first paradox. When he took over Einsatzgruppe D, operating in Bessarabia, southern Ukraine, and Crimea, Ohlendorf established a system of killing that was chillingly industrial and bureaucratic. He wanted death to be orderly, quick, and humane. But the word humane in Ohlendorf's dictionary was not for the trembling victims before the gun barrels. It was for the men pulling the triggers. He noticed that indiscriminate shooting caused severe psychological trauma to his soldiers. He saw his men haunted, alcoholic, or suffering mental breakdowns after having to look into the eyes of children before shooting them. As a dedicated commander, Ohlendorf decided he had to intervene. He didn't order the killing to stop. He ordered its optimization. He strictly forbade any personal torture. Victims were not allowed to be beaten or insulted. They were to be rounded up, registered by name, a deceptive step to create a sense of security and order, and then led to the execution site. At the mass graves, Ohlendorf applied a military normalization to the massacre. Instead of letting soldiers shoot randomly, he ordered the formation of firing squads. A command would ring out and all would pull the trigger together. This allowed the individual soldier to diffuse responsibility. No one knew whose bullet killed whom. It was a collective act, a military duty, not individual murder. Furthermore, Ohlendorf, a father of 5 children, made a decision he considered most merciful. He forbade the separation of mothers from their children. He argued that separating children from their mothers would cause panic, screaming, and painful scenes, which would damage the morale of the execution squads. Therefore, he ordered mothers to hold their children and be shot simultaneously. He called it calmness. He believed he was doing a favor. Imagine that scene through the eyes of a psychoanalyst. A man stands on the edge of the pit, observing women clutching their children. He nods, not out of compassion for the dying child, but because of the orderly silence of the process. He is satisfied that there is no chaotic screaming to disturb the nerves of the killers. That is the ultimate perversion of intellect, using logic to justify absolute savagery. December 1941, Simferopol. Christmas was approaching. Ohlendorf wanted to complete the quota before the holiday so his soldiers could celebrate Christmas with peace of mind. Over 14,000 Jews and Gypsies were rounded up. During those days, Ohlendorf did not hide in a warm office. He went to the scene. He stood there in his impeccably pressed SS uniform, his polished leather boots unblemished by a single speck of dust, observing the enormous pits being filled with corpses. He did not hold a gun. He never personally shot anyone. He merely stood there, serving as a quality control supervisor. A telling detail was recorded. Ohlendorf genuinely disliked the sight of blood. He was a fastidious person, but he forced himself to stand there, witnessing every volley to set an example for his soldiers. He wanted to show them, if I, an intellectual, a commander, can endure this burden for Germany, then you must be able to do it too. He turned the crime into a noble sacrifice. He convinced his soldiers that they were not murderers, but silent heroes bearing a terrible but necessary mission to protect the future of the nation. That's how he brainwashed them and brainwashed himself. But even with this optimization, guns were still too crude for Otto Ohlendorf's sensitive soul. He began to complain to his superiors in Berlin. He sent detailed reports analyzing the seelische Belastung, psychological burden his soldiers were enduring. He wrote about nightmares, empty liquor bottles, and potential moral decay. He did not ask to stop the killing. He asked for a better method of killing, a cleaner method, a method that would help his soldiers avoid looking into the eyes of the victims. And Berlin responded. Special trucks were sent. They looked like ordinary delivery vans, painted gray or dark blue, discreet and harmless. But under the chassis, the exhaust pipe was redesigned to route carbon monoxide, gas back into the airtight compartment in the rear. Gas vans. The arrival of these vehicles marked a shift in Ohlendorf's psychology. From a military commander, he transitioned to the role of a factory manager. The raw material was living humans. The processing procedure was the truck engine. The output product was lifeless bodies. He personally inspected these vehicles. He calculated the time required for the gas to kill everyone in the compartment, usually 10 to 15 minutes. He directed the camouflage of the vehicles so victims wouldn't suspect anything. He ordered the drivers to press the accelerator steadily, not too fast to avoid unnecessary pain, and also to avoid damaging the vehicle, but not too slow for the procedure to proceed on schedule. There is an event that highlights Ohlendorf's complete emotional detachment. During one inspection of the gas van usage, when the rear doors were opened and piles of corpses tumbled out, soiled with excretions and twisted together in their final death throes, many SS soldiers had to turn away and vomit. Ohlendorf did not. He observed meticulously, recording technical issues. His face showed not disgust for death, but dissatisfaction with the hygiene problem. He complained that cleaning up the bodies stuck together took too much time and was dirty for his soldiers. He requested improvements to the corpse unloading procedure. To him, those people were no longer people. They were biological waste that needed disposal. At the Nuremberg trial, when asked about his feelings at the time, Ohlendorf replied with a cold logic that sent shivers down the spine of the listeners. I did not allow personal feelings to interfere with my duty. If I had let compassion surface, I would have betrayed my orders and my country. He genuinely believed that. He did not see himself as evil. He saw himself as a victim of circumstances, a loyal soldier forced to carry out a terrible task assigned by history. He even compared his actions to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, arguing that killing the enemy's women and children was an inevitable part of total war. That is the portrait of Otto Ohlendorf during the darkest years of the 20th century, a man who could read Goethe in the evening after directing the massacre of thousands in the morning, a monster clothed in the garments of civilization and intellect. He is living proof that education, degrees, and culture are not a vaccine against evil. Sometimes they are merely tools to execute evil more efficiently. But history has its own way of exacting payment, and the Nuremberg trial was just the beginning of this intellectual's painful end. When the mask of logic was torn away, would the monster inside still retain that cold composure when facing his own death? Nuremberg 1948. The Einsatzgruppe trial, case number 9, was more than just a criminal trial. For Otto Ohlendorf, it was a final academic podium. While his co-defendants, men like Paul Blobel or Otto Rasch, tried to deny guilt, feign madness, or shift blame to superior orders, Ohlendorf chose a different path. A path far more arrogant and terrifying. He decided to use his superior intellect to educate the American judges on the necessity of genocide. He stood before the dock, neither trembling nor bowing his head. He looked straight into the eyes of Chief Judge Michael Musmano, a passionate Italian-American, and presented his doctrine. There was no plea for leniency, only the cold defense of a monster who believed he was a hero. Ohlendorf's argument revolved around the concept of putative nitwehr, putative or anticipatory self-defense. He argued in a measured, rhythmic tone as if presenting in a university lecture hall. Germany was threatened by Bolshevism and the Jews. If we did not act first, they would destroy us. It was not murder. It was an act of preventing a historical catastrophe. He spoke about killing Jewish children. He did not use words like slaughter or massacre. He used the term elimination of potential for revenge. He argued that if those children were allowed to survive after their parents had been killed, they would grow up with hatred and become a future threat to Germany. Therefore, killing them was an act of long-term security assurance. A perfect and cruel circular logic: kill the parents for self-defense, then kill the children to protect oneself from the revenge for having killed the parents. The entire courtroom shuddered at this absolute emotionlessness. Prosecutor Benjamin Ferencz, who had seen the mass graves with his own eyes, felt nauseous at Ohlendorf's composure. But Ohlendorf did not care about their feelings. He saw them as naive, people who did not understand the brutality of the law of survival between nations. He even counterattacked. He accused the Allies of hypocrisy. You bombed Dresden, killing tens of thousands of women and children in a firestorm. You dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. What is the difference? He asked, his bright eyes challenging. I killed people with a gun one by one under orders. You killed people with a button in masses from above. Why am I a criminal and you are the judges? That was the moment Otto Ohlendorf most clearly revealed his core nature, the intellectual arrogance that separated him from humanity. He believed he stood above conventional moral rules. He believed that history, not this court, would judge him right. But history and justice have their own voices. April 10, 1948, the verdict was delivered. Judge Musmano read the sentence in a stern voice: death by hanging. How did Ohlendorf receive this news? He did not collapse, he did not weep. He merely smirked faintly, a half-smile full of contempt. He viewed the sentence as proof of Victor's justice, not punishment for his crime. He was handcuffed and led to his cell, his back still straight, his head still held high. He believed he was a martyr for the Nazi ideology. Landsberg Prison, 1948-1951. 3 years waiting on death row. This was where time became the most relentless torturer. The cold stone walls of Landsberg, where Hitler once wrote Mein Kampf, now held his most loyal disciples. While he waited for his execution day, the outside world changed. The Cold War began. The US and the Soviet Union went from allies to enemies. Suddenly, Ohlendorf's anti-communist arguments seemed to find some sympathy in far-right political circles in West Germany and even among some US officials. There were calls for clemency. There were lobbying efforts to reduce the sentences for these anti-Bolshevik soldiers. Ohlendorf knew this, and hope began to creep into his mind, not the hope of living to repent, but the hope of being vindicated. He continued to write, continued to argue, continued to believe that his logic would convince the world. He was still the professor in a red prison uniform. But the U.S. High Commissioner for Germany, John J. McCloy, after reviewing the files, made the final decision. No clemency for the leaders of the Einsatzgruppen. The number of victims was too vast, the crime too evident, the inhumanity too brutal to forgive. May 1951, the final news broke. The plea for clemency was rejected. The execution date was set, June 7, 1951. This was when the human began to crack beneath the intellectual veneer, when death was no longer a philosophical concept or a statistic, but a physical reality counting down by the hour. Ohlendorf's emotional detachment was put to the ultimate test. The last night he didn't sleep. He wrote letters to his wife and 5 children. The letters were still full of dogmatic rhetoric, urging his children to live courageously and honestly. He still tried to maintain the image of the exemplary father, the misunderstood hero. But the prison guards noted that his hands had begun to tremble. Not much, just a slight vibration when holding the pen, but it betrayed the rising biological fear. Dawn of June 7, 1951, Landsberg Prison Yard. The sky was gray, the air was damp. 2 black gallows stood tall in the yard, like wooden monsters awaiting their breakfast. This was the final journey for the Nazi war criminals convicted by the Nuremberg court. Ohlendorf was one of the last to step out. He wore his neatest prison uniform, his hair was slicked back, he tried to walk decisively but his feet seemed heavier than usual. He saw the simple wooden coffins lined up in the corner of the yard. He saw the chaplain murmuring prayers. He saw the executioner, a professional American soldier with an expressionless face. This time there were no gas vans, no firing squad hidden behind rifles, no safe distance. Death was standing right in front of him, naked and brutal. He walked up the 13 steps of the gallows. The sound of his footsteps echoed dryly on the wood. Standing on the trapdoor, he was asked if he had any last words. Once again, the professor instinct surfaced. He wanted a final speech, but there was no time for lengthy arguments. He spoke briefly, asserting his innocence before God and history, that he only carried out his duty out of love for Germany. He remained stubborn until his last breath. But then the black hood was placed over his head. Otto Ohlendorf's world, the world of books, of statistics, of supremacist theories, suddenly went dark, leaving only the darkness of coarse canvas rubbing against his face. The executioner adjusted the knot of the rope. It was positioned right below the left ear bone, calculated to break the neck fastest. The cruel irony, a man who always calculated efficient death for others was now dependent on others' calculation for his own death. "Ready," the executioner signaled. Ohlendorf stood there in the darkness of the hood. Perhaps in that moment the images of 90,000 ghosts appeared, or did he just see mathematical formulas shattering? No one knows, only that beneath the black cloth his breathing was labored. The lever was pulled. The trapdoor swung open. Otto Ohlendorf's body fell freely into the void. Gravity, a law of physics that does not distinguish race or degree, pulled him down with brutal force. The rope went taut. The sound of his neck bones snapping echoed, a dry sound that ended all debate. But death did not come instantly as theorized. Reports recorded that his body convulsed violently. The survival instinct flared up fiercely. His chest constricted for air, his limbs thrashed unconsciously like a puppet with cut strings. No more solemnity, no more composure, only the reflex of a dying creature. He hung there swaying in the air. His face, swollen and purple, was hidden behind the hood. His sphincters relaxed. The filth that he had always detested now covered his own body. That was the final humiliation, the absolute equality of death. 12 minutes later, the military doctor stepped forward, placing a stethoscope on his chest. A silence fell over the prison yard. The body was lowered, placed into one of the cheap wooden coffins. Otto Ohlendorf, Doctor of Law, SS Major General, Architect of Industrial Death, was now just an anonymous corpse, waiting to be buried in an unmarked grave. Justice was served. It did not argue with him. It did not use philosophy to refute him. It simply erased his existence from the world. The fate of Otto Ohlendorf leaves a haunting question for posterity, a question as cold as the man himself. When we separate intellect from the heart, when we turn people into numbers on a report, are we nurturing an Ohlendorf monster within our own civilized society? He died, but the shadow of bureaucratic cruelty still lingers, reminding us. The most dangerous murderers are not those who hold a knife in a dark alley, but those who hold a pen in brightly lit offices, signing death warrants with a clean conscience.